Okay, 12:01, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Philip Osteen, Dean of the University of Utah College of Social Work. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to our first Social Work Beyond the Classroom event of 2024. As the name of the series suggests, these presentations allow us to delve into the work that engages our faculty members outside of the classroom and to provide learning opportunities for students, graduates, and others in our community. Welcome and thank you for making time to join us live or to those who are watching the recording at a later time. I also want to sincerely thank everyone who's donated while registering. These donations will support the SWAZO Social Justice Scholarship, which supports students who show a strong commitment to economic and social justice. Again, we are grateful for your generosity. Before we get to the presentation today, on behalf of the College of Social Work, I want to acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the endearing relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationships between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. As you may be aware, January is National Slavery and Human Trafficking Awareness Month. And within that context, we're especially honored to welcome Dr. Lindsay Gezinski, who will discuss her research and practice with survivors of human trafficking. Dr. Gezinski is an associate professor of social work and director of the Master of Social Work program here at the University of Utah. She previously served as a visiting scholar at the University of Amsterdam and Leiden University in the Netherlands. Her research focuses on gender-based violence, human trafficking, and intimate labor, both domestically and internationally. She's a mixed methodologist with expertise in qualitative research and skilled at collaborating with community partners and those with lived experience. A first-generation university graduate, Dr. Gezinski earned her PhD in social work and a graduate minor in women's gender and sexuality studies at The Ohio State University, where she also earned her MSW and an MA in public policy and management. Following her presentation, Dr. Gezinski will have about 10 minutes to respond to your questions. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit those questions. And finally, we encourage you to be attentive to yourself and your own well-being during this event. This topic can be challenging for everyone, but especially for those who have lived experience. If you reach a point during this presentation when you feel that you need to take a break, we really encourage you to do so, and feel free to come back to the recording at a later time. I invite the remaining attendees to join me in a commitment to refrain from making assumptions about individuals' lived experiences or their comfort level with direct outreach from others, whether they remain or leave the presentation or based on their questions today. We trust that everyone here can reach out for the support they need, but if you need additional support, we encourage you to utilize the Safe UT app. And with that, Dr. Gezinski, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Dean Osteen, for that wonderful and warm introduction. I am so pleased to be with you today, and we have a great showing. I am excited to be outside of the classroom and to hear from you as practitioners throughout the state of Utah, and I've heard coming from other locations as well. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. So again, my name is Dr. Lindsay Gezinski. I'm an associate professor and MSW program director here at the College of Social Work at the University of Utah. My presentation is called Centering Rights Over Rescue, Rethinking Criminal Justice Approaches to Sex Trafficking and the Sex Trades. So at the end of this presentation, I'd like to accomplish several things. So our agenda today is to understand the problem of human trafficking, to debunk myths and misinformation associated with human trafficking, to assess challenges with criminal justice approaches, consider rights-based strategies, and then at the end, we'll have a question and answer session. So feel free to put those questions in the chat. And then also, just to repeat what Dean Osteen said, some of this content may be triggering, so please feel free to step away, take care of yourself during the presentation. I will say that I'm not going to be sharing direct quotes that illustrate sexual exploitation or violence. So I'd just like to take a moment, and I assume that you all can see each other within the chat. So feel free to introduce yourself, what discipline or area you're coming from. And I'd like you to take a moment to think about this question. So what comes to mind when you think about human trafficking? Do you have any conceptions about the type of exploitation that is associated with human trafficking? Does a certain age, race, nationality, socioeconomic status, or gender identity come to mind when you think about it? Do you imagine human trafficking happening in certain countries? What about the flow of human trafficking? Do you imagine transport across state or international lines? And I'd also like you to take a moment to think about where these ideas come from. Do you have personal experience working with survivors? Do these come from popular media? So again, just take a moment to think about what comes to mind when you think about human trafficking. So here we see some of the misconceptions that are oftentimes associated with human trafficking, and oftentimes these come from popular media. These influence our understanding of human trafficking. Human trafficking myths are common in mainstream media and fail to portray human trafficking as a complex issue. So people often associate human trafficking with abduction and physical restraint, when in reality, many individuals are lured through deceit, manipulation, or coercion. Narratives often perpetuate the idea that trafficking survivors lack any form of autonomy and are in desperate need of rescue. Contrary to common belief, human trafficking is not confined to specific demographic groups or locations, and research demonstrates that both the cases and survivors of human trafficking are varied. Belief in human trafficking myths impedes victim identification, is associated with victim blaming, and affects the believability of human trafficking narratives. Additionally, the idea that trafficking only occurs internationally is false. It's a pervasive problem domestically. By dispelling these myths, we can better understand and combat human trafficking, foster a more informed and empathetic community response. So I'd also like to talk about some of the misinformation that often accompanies human trafficking. So here we see an article from the New York Times, which is outlining QAnon followers are hijacking the Save the Children movement, which is associated with human trafficking. But when considering these myths that surround human trafficking, we need to consider the QAnon conspiracy theory. So QAnon is a disproven and discredited far-right conspiracy theory that originated in the United States. It emerged in 2017 on online forums and gained traction among certain political circles, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. The central claim of QAnon is that a secret cabal of satanic pedophiles, often involving prominent political figures and celebrities, is running a global child trafficking and abuse ring. This theory is not supported by any credible evidence and has been widely debunked. The spread of QAnon-related misinformation has been a concern, as it can contribute to the promotion of false narratives and the potential for harm. So the conspiracy theories like QAnon can have detrimental effects when we think about identification, use of our resources, and evidence-based approaches. So moving on, I'd like to describe the legal definition of human trafficking. So here in this figure, we see the AMP model of human trafficking that involves action, means, and purpose. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, or TVPA, defines human trafficking as involving the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person through force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of sexual exploitation or forced labor. But when it comes to minors, the TVPA considers any commercial sex act with a minor a form of human trafficking, regardless of the presence of force, fraud, or coercion. So sometimes you might hear the term minor sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation of children. Transport across international, state, or county lines is not required to meet the legal definition of human trafficking. Human trafficking can take a variety of forms. Today, I will be talking about sexual exploitation, and I'll be using the term sex trafficking. But it's important to remember, again, that human trafficking takes lots of different forms. So again, this includes sexual exploitation, forced labor, debt bondage, domestic servitude, organ removal, forced begging, child soldiers, and forced marriage. So human trafficking also happens in a variety of settings. These could include hotels, private residences, restaurants, factories and sweatshops, construction sites, farms, and agricultural settings. And even though I'm focusing on sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, I'd also like to note that that form of human trafficking tends to get the most attention. And it's important also to remember these other forms, especially forced labor. Traffickers exert control through a variety of tactics. These include intimidation, physical, sexual, and verbal abuse, inducing substance use, withholding earnings, and threatening reports to immigration enforcement. So the scale of human trafficking is significant, and it's difficult to know how big the problem is because of the clandestine nature of human trafficking. So while these numbers are difficult, the International Labor Organization estimated that approximately 50 million individuals experienced human trafficking in 2021. And we also see from this figure here, from the Global Data Hub on Human Trafficking, that it's happening all over the world. So we see documented human trafficking cases in 109 countries, with incidents again across continents. And this accounts for both trafficking that's happening within country as well as between countries. So again, trafficking can happen within borders or across borders. Again, the actual incidence of human trafficking is super difficult to determine. So this graph shows the prevalence of exploitation types from 2007 to 2021. The orange line indicates forced labor, the yellow line sexual exploitation, and the blue line represents other types of exploitation. So in 2021, we see that the majority of identified trafficking cases involved forced labor, while just under 25% involved sexual exploitation, and about 22% were for other types of exploitation. Again, this represents cases identified by organizations, so this could be underreporting and may not represent the actual prevalence for the different types of exploitation. Trafficked persons can be girls, boys, women, men, and non-binary people who are diverse with respect to race, ethnicity, nationality, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status. So according to the United Nations Office on the Drugs and Crime, 71% of trafficked persons are women and girls, and 28% are children globally. However, some research suggests that women and girls are more frequently survivors of sex trafficking, whereas men and boys are more often exploited through forced labor. I'd also like to make a note that trans and non-binary folks experience disproportionate rates of exploitation and are particularly vulnerable. So while my presentation is focused on sex trafficking primarily, I would like to take a moment to differentiate sex trafficking from sex work. So my research has involved both sex trafficking and sex work in South Asia and the United States, and that includes some work here in Utah. And this includes conducting research with women, adults who are sex workers. Some of them reported having a trafficking experience and others did not. And again, I'd like to distinguish between sex trafficking versus sex work. So sex work is a term created by sex workers and refers to the exchange of sexual services for money or goods. And these could include food, housing, or substances and other materials. As previously stated, sex trafficking involves the presence of force, fraud, or coercion, which is not present when we are considering sex work. The term sex work is viewed as less stigmatizing and encourages us to consider the labor rights of sex workers. Again, it's important to avoid conflating sex trafficking and sex work. And as Dean Osteen said, I did spend some time in the Netherlands. So I'm also very interested to talk about different policy approaches when we think about criminalization, decriminalization, and legalization. So moving on to some of the research that I've done in the past, my research and that of others has found a variety of factors that contribute to vulnerability to sex trafficking. So these include poverty, child abuse and neglect, physical and sexual violence, the death of a parent, system involvement, such as in child welfare and foster care systems, and having a history of running away. So these contributors to sex trafficking can also vary based on country context and region. So we also need to think about globally these structural contributors to human trafficking, which could include armed conflicts, forced displacement, climate change, that all contribute to vulnerability. So contrary to representations in pop culture, traffickers are unlikely to kidnap a stranger off of the street. While a trafficker may be a stranger, they may also be an acquaintance, a friend, an intimate partner, or a family member. So in one study that we conducted, and this was actually in India, 70% of traffickers were known to the survivor. So they were a family member or an acquaintance. And so it's important, again, to remember that exploiters or traffickers can be known to the survivor or unknown. I'd also like to point out that marginalized and minoritized populations are particularly at risk for human trafficking, and several factors contribute to this vulnerability. So vulnerability can stem from social, economic, and individual circumstances that traffickers exploit. So vulnerable populations include BIPOC communities, especially Indigenous people and Black people, as well as individuals who identify as LGBTQI+, low income and undocumented immigrants, individuals who have disabilities and who are unhoused or marginally housed are also vulnerable. And I think it's also important to think about intersectionality and how these different identities can intersect to make folks vulnerable to being coerced or exploited by a trafficker. So in our research with both sex workers and trafficking survivors, we found that individuals experience violence from a variety of sources, and these include intimate partners, police, and clients. This includes physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological violence. So sex trafficking has a variety of consequences impacting survivors physically, emotionally, and psychologically. And I've listed some of these consequences here that we've identified in our research, as well as the research of others. So some of these consequences are headaches, abdominal pain, fatigue, depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance use, self-harm, suicide attempts, unintended pregnancies, HIV and other STIs, and physical injuries. As stated earlier, each trafficking case is unique, and so it really requires services that are individualized to best meet the needs of survivors. So some of the needs that my team and others have identified have included basic needs. So those include things like food and clothing, emergency, transitional, and long-term housing, mental health and substance use treatment, medical care and reproductive health services, legal assistance and advocacy, immigration services, such as to secure a T visa, financial assistance, stable employment, and life skills education. And what I'll likely get to later is that someone that's being trafficked is very unlikely to come to, for instance, a service provider and say, hey, I'm a victim, I'm a survivor of trafficking. They may approach you for some of these needs, to meet their basic needs, to seek out mental health treatment. So making sure to address these primary needs is probably where you would encounter someone who is a survivor of trafficking. So moving on to approaches that are taken to address human trafficking. So again, The focus of this presentation is really to think about these criminal justice approaches, which tend to dominate the human trafficking field, both nationally within the United States as well as internationally. So the United States Department of State endorses the 3Ps framework for addressing human trafficking, including prosecution, protection, and prevention. So this includes the investigation, arrest, and prosecution of individuals involved in human trafficking. Protection focuses on ensuring the safety, well-being, and rights of trafficking survivors. So this could include providing survivors with safe housing, healthcare, legal assistance, counseling, and other supportive services. And then finally, prevention efforts are aimed at addressing the root causes of human trafficking and stopping it before it occurs. This includes awareness campaigns, education programs, and initiatives designed to reduce vulnerabilities and change societal attitudes. So finally, the U.S. Department of State endorses partnerships as well to really achieve progress around these 3Ps. And I contend that a lot of the funding tends to get devoted to prosecution and criminal legal approaches. And we're seeing that with the protection, prevention, that we're really in need of more funding to address these different approaches. So again, the criminal justice approach, including raid and rescue missions, dominates anti-traffic efforts and funding priorities. Some law enforcement and social service providers have expressed the belief that arrest and detention are required to assist trafficked youth. Research suggests that law enforcement may arrest trafficked people in an effort to protect them or to garner witness testimony against the trafficker. So again, this can cause re-traumatization, right, of survivors of trafficking. They have experienced trauma within their trafficking experience, and then the way that we in systems interact, whether it's the criminal legal system, social services, healthcare profession, can potentially re-traumatize survivors. These arrests can also result in victim blaming and stigmatization. And critics argue that criminal justice approaches often prioritize reactive measures, such as prosecution and law enforcement, over proactive prevention strategies to address the root causes of sex trafficking. So I'd like to take a moment to talk about some folks who have critiqued the criminal legal approaches to these kinds of issues. And I've included a couple texts here on the screen if you're interested, because I'm sure you want to, read these in your free time. But again, I would like to talk about some critiques, especially related to carceral feminism. So traditionally, carceral feminism has relied on the criminal justice system, including incarceration, as a primary tool to address and combat gender-based violence and exploitation. So we see this a lot in the domestic violence movement of the 70s and the move to more of a criminal justice approach to these types of violence. And that's true for trafficking as well. Critics argue that relying heavily on criminalization can disproportionately impact marginalized communities, perpetuate systemic inequalities, and undermine the rights and agency of individuals involved in the sex trades, including trafficked persons. So some contend as well that criminalization of commercial sex makes individuals more scared, even if they're experiencing trafficking, of reporting the problem. So I'd like to highlight the works of Elizabeth Bernstein and Jennifer Musto, who consider carceral feminism and carceral protectionism related to sex trafficking. I'd also like to note the work of Angela Davis, Michelle Alexander, and others who critique the prison industrial complex. So here, this is an article that recently came out in the Washington Post, I think in 2021. And it really makes us think about sex trafficked kids or crime victims. In Las Vegas, they still go to jail. So criminal justice approaches may also result in the criminalization of trafficked persons themselves. Law enforcement have indicated that determining the true identity of trafficked people can be difficult, and many would say, I'm trying to protect this person, and arrest or seems to be the way to do that. But information gathered from a national subsample of law enforcement agencies found that 31% of youth picked up for commercial sex were treated as delinquents by the criminal justice system. Another study of 6 US cities revealed that the percentage of victims treated as offenders may be as high as 40%. This is concerning because the criminal versus victim status affects access to shelter and other services, and youths who are female, 15 years old or younger, appeared frightened, had a history of running away, were more likely to be treated as victims, and minors reported to police were actually 65 times more likely to be treated as victims than minors discovered through police action. Finally, police were less likely to prosecute youth who had an advocate, were community residents, had a pimp or third-party exploiter, were seeking aid, cooperated with the police, and did not have a prior record. So here in Utah, we conducted a study, and I'd just like to include a quote here that says, there are still departments throughout the state that have an arrest first, ask questions later mentality. I think that really destroys trust with survivors. So people experiencing trafficking are really unlikely to come forward to law enforcement, and that's for a variety of reasons. So someone that's experienced trafficking may be coached by the trafficker to avoid police and instructed how to respond if they are approached by police or law enforcement. And survivors may also experience trauma bonding with their trafficker or have retaliatory concerns if they were to approach law enforcement. Other reasons that a person might not come forward include fear of being disbelieved, embarrassment, a history of negative experience with law enforcement or other systems, and fears of arrest and deportation. So specific to Utah, we found that survivors of human trafficking lack knowledge of the services available to them, do not self-identify again as a victim, lack trust in criminal legal systems, and experience feelings of shame, hopelessness, and worthlessness. So our participants reported that survivors may experience victim blaming, misidentification, and language and cultural barriers when attempting to access services. So research suggests that trafficked persons come into contact with systems such as healthcare, but that they're not regularly being identified. So another quote from a study that we conducted, and this was a survivor who stated, sure, they, meaning survivors, don't access clinics. They access hospitals very rarely. I think that when it maybe comes to incarceration, they might have access medical services, but that is about as far as it gets. There is such a face of shame and guilt, and is a pretty shame-based population. So you don't really want to be seen. In other cases, survivors may be criminalized for crimes committed during the course of their trafficking experience. So I've highlighted a book written by Centoya Brown Long called Free Centoya, My Search for Redemption in the American Prison System, where Centoya does tell her own story. You may have also seen some, I believe there's a documentary and some media coverage about this case in particular. And this is quite an extreme case. So Centoya, her case gained widespread attention due to its connection to sex trafficking. Born in 1988, Brown experienced a troubled childhood marked by neglect, abuse, and homelessness. At the age of 16, she became a victim of sex trafficking. So in 2004, at the age of 16, Centoya was arrested and charged with the murder of a 43-year-old man who had solicited her for sex. Brown argued that she killed the man in self-defense, fearing for her life, given her history of abuse and circumstances of the encounter. Despite her age and history of exploitation, she was tried as an adult and sentenced to life in prison. Brown's case garnered attention from activists and celebrities who highlighted the impact of her traumatic experiences on her actions and the broader issue of juvenile justice and sex trafficking. After significant public outcry and legal advocacy in 2019, Tennessee Governor Haslam granted her clemency. So Centolla was released from prison after serving 15 years and has since become an advocate for criminal justice reform, focusing on issues related to juvenile justice and the rights of trafficking survivors. Her case underscored the complex intersections between trafficking, trauma, and the criminal justice system. So you might see folks interacting with the criminal justice system for other crimes. Maybe that has to do with burglary or theft or another crime as well. So something to keep in mind. So when encountering criminal legal spaces, survivors are not always treated from a trauma-informed perspective. For example, one of our study participants said, survivors of human trafficking are in juvie or in a detention. They need housing as soon as they're released, and they need immediate medical attention. Then you're navigating this legal to judicial system when they are taking a minor to the local medical facility in cuffs, in a jumpsuit for a rape kit, and it just becomes complicated. The staff don't understand, and people are wanting to take the cuffs off before the exam and can't remove the handcuffs. So now I'd like to move on to some approaches, policy approaches that states have taken to address this criminalization. So here we see a figure that really outlines safe harbor laws. And as it says here, comprehensive safe harbor laws should prohibit arresting, detaining, charging, and prosecuting all minors of prostitution offenses, regardless of whether a finding of trafficking victimization is made, and instead require law enforcement to direct child and youth survivors to specialized services and care. So again, these are really attempts to prohibit the criminalization of sex trafficking survivors. And this figure really shows you the number of states that have implemented some sort of safe harbor law. So the majority of states have enacted safe harbor legislation to prevent minors from being prosecuted for commercial sex and other related status offenses and divert them to social services. So again, these social services may include child protective services and access to housing, mental health services, substance use treatment, and employment services. However, safe harbor legislation varies widely across states, with some providing immunity to all minors picked up for commercial sex, and others requiring youths to prove that they are a victim of sex trafficking. So it makes us think about how would a person prove that they are a victim of sex trafficking? And inadequate funding impedes the effective implementation of safe harbor legislation, namely the provision of these comprehensive services. So since we're in Utah right now, I'd like to note that the state of Utah does have a non-criminalization law and statutory referral to services. The majority of states have also implemented vacature laws, and this means that survivors can vacate or expunge criminal convictions related to their trafficking experience. Again, since we're in Utah, I would like to highlight some of the legislative bills that are currently being considered during the 2024 Utah legislative session. So I've highlighted three here. We have House Bill 146, which is human trafficking amendments. And this directs the Office of the Attorney General to hire a state human trafficking intervention coordinator who would coordinate support for survivors throughout the state, provide support to prosecutors, and target awareness and education. House Bill 133, Human Trafficking Expungement Amendments. This would allow an individual to seek expungement of records for commercial sex in cases of force, fraud, or coercion. And finally, House Bill 209, Human Trafficking Civil Action Amendments. This would clarify the requirements for bringing a civil action for human trafficking. So just some legislative bills you might want to keep your eye on. There's also an interesting bill around consent that's being, affirmative consent that's being proposed that I think ties into these concepts of sex trafficking. So in addition to legislative efforts, I'd now like to briefly cover some points related to prevention, screening and identification, and response and aftercare. But first, I know that many of us are social workers, and I'd like to discuss what is a rights-based approach. So we've talked a lot about these criminal legal approaches, and what is a rights-based approach? So I've included this quote from Freedom Network, and this is a human trafficking coalition network that states a rights-based approach places a survivor's priorities and narrative at the center of anti-trafficking work. The model relies on voluntary, non-judgmental assistance with an emphasis on self-determination to best meet survivors' short and long-term needs. And so I'd like to take a moment to really point out that self-determination piece. We talk a lot about that in social work. And so I think that social workers are really poised based on our ethical standards to address the issue of human trafficking. So again, social workers have the ability to identify, intervene, and advocate for trafficked survivors. Social workers are ideal first responders due to our ethics. Again, we have the ethic of dignity and respect, client self-determination, and social justice. Social workers training allows us to respond in a trauma-informed way with survivors who would otherwise be deemed resistant by law enforcement. So many of us have experience with trauma. And I think that many of those same concepts, I'm not a therapist, but many of the same concepts when it comes to trauma can be applied to sex trafficking. And I think sometimes as well, there's this schism between sex trafficking being siloed from domestic violence or sexual violence. And I think there's a lot of overlaps, both in the problem, but as well as how we can address these problems together. So getting out of those silos. Anti-trafficking education, I know that there has been some efforts to educate, I believe, high schoolers on the signs of human trafficking. And we can think about targeting educators, social service providers, and communities. But I'd also like to note that when we think about education, again, thinking about breaking down the silos, we can focus on curriculum related to, healthy relationships, consent, and violence prevention. So some programming has been conducted with youth, frequently vulnerable youth, that focuses on increasing resiliency and protective factors. So looking beyond just risk. But prevention also requires us to center those marginalized populations, right, that we talked about earlier. These folks may be at higher risk. So folks like LGBTQI+, Indigenous and unhoused youth may be particularly vulnerable. And we should also be addressing these structural factors that contribute to human trafficking, such as affordable housing, employment opportunities, and structural oppression. So I would also like to note, and just as an example, that we have lots of legislation around gender identity and sexual orientation. And I think that this contributes to the amount of stigma for certain identities. And this can also contribute to potentially maybe a youth being kicked out of their house, of running away. And some research suggests, again, that youth who do not have a home, are homeless, are at particular risk for sex trafficking. Scholars have also pointed to the importance of identification. And this includes identification in lots of different settings, right? So whether that's social service, medical settings, within educational systems, immigration, criminal, legal, to identify and assist survivors. And there has been some research on awareness raising among different providers, so medical providers, social service providers. That training on awareness does work. People do become informed. They learn about what the problem might look like, but it's not necessarily translating to referrals to services or responding to the problem. So we really need to go beyond awareness raising to think about identification, and then also where we go beyond that. So we need these services, right? If I've identified someone, now what do I do? Also, researchers had advocated for universal screening for system-involved youth, such as those who encounter the juvenile justice and child welfare systems. And I've just included a couple screening instruments here, and there are a lot. So one is the trafficking victim identification tool. And this looks more broadly at sex trafficking and labor trafficking through the Vera Institute, as well as the rapid appraisal for trafficking. These authors looked specifically in the emergency room, so they validated this rapid appraisal with patients to identify those who are experiencing sex trafficking versus labor trafficking. And again, it's important in our identification to make sure that we're differentiating between sex work and sex trafficking. Again, identification alone is insufficient, right? We need institutional policies. We need proper protocols of how to respond following this identification. So ideally, it would be great if these identified survivors would be linked with a human trafficking advocate, so someone who's able to coordinate survivor-centered and empowerment-based wraparound services. And as we've talked about before, each case of human trafficking, each survivor is quite different, right? So each survivor is going to have different needs, and we need to be responsive of what those needs are. Again, response really requires interorganizational collaboration. I talked a little bit about how we become siloed, and this really requires us to work together across child welfare, housing, domestic violence, healthcare, mental health services, so that we can serve survivors with these individualized care plans. And anecdotally, I'll talk a little bit about housing in a moment. Sometimes survivors of sex trafficking attempt to access services and don't meet the criteria for an agency and might be turned away. Just some anecdotal information. Finally, survivors require culturally responsive and trauma-informed services, and that includes making sure that we have staff who look like survivors, who are bilingual, who understand culture of survivors to respond in this way. So I know that this is a very, intense topic, and I'd like to close by centering the resilience. I think that many of us who work in the social work field, we're just a strengths-based profession, and realizing that you're more than what's happened to you. And I think that's important here to end, is that we really need to center resilience for survivors. And I love this quote from a survivor and service provider who said, "These women are so shamed and they are so depleted and demoralized and deconstructed. So there has to be some ignition of some kind of rebuild of that, of like, you are worth it. I don't feel sorry for you. I see you, you are worthy, you are enough, you're a beautiful soul." Once that starts to take hold, when survivors can start responding to other things. So again, establishing that trust, I think, is really key in serving survivors of human trafficking, and centering those strengths and the resilience of survivors, and recognizing that survivors are really experts in their own lived experience. So in conclusion, again, thank you so much for being with me today. I hope that you've learned a little bit. I know this was a broad swath of the field, but I hope that you've learned about some of the myths and misinformation, so you can go to those like family gatherings and be able to, dispel some of that misinformation. I'd also like to close and recognize the plurality of survivor identities and experiences. So the experience of trafficking can look very different, and the survivor can look really different. And finally, I'd really like to prioritize rights-based approaches and center protection and prevention over the criminalization of survivors. Finally, this is a little personal plug. I received a small grant through the university to conduct a study, and it's a national exploratory study on housing services for survivors of human trafficking. So I'm really interested to know about what this housing services are currently available. Does this look like residential, transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, and what's really meeting the needs for survivors? I was selected to be a faculty mentor with the summer program for undergraduate research through the Undergraduate Office for Research Education. So this summer, I will be working with one undergraduate student working with me full-time. It is paid for a student if they're interested in this topic to get some research skills. So the deadline for students to apply is January 28th. And I'd like to open it up for questions. I have included the National Human Trafficking Hotline here. And this is someone who may be a survivor or someone who comes into contact with a survivor. This is the number to call. So we see it's 1-888-373-7888. Again, the National Human Trafficking Hotline. You're also able to text this number, be free, or they have a live chat at humantraffickinghotline.org. This is a 24/7 toll-free hotline. It's confidential, and they have 200 plus languages that they're able to communicate in. So a great resource. And before I open it up for questions, here is my contact information. I love talking to people. So you can feel free to contact me in my email. I also have this QR code. If you'd like to access my bio, you can see what I've been up to with publications, presentations, or if you'd like to chat further about this topic, I'm always happy to. So thank you again for attending, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Okay, so so we have several questions here. And we have an anonymous attendee. I thought this might be brought up. It says, with the two agencies who are not under hot water for assisting in this matter in Utah, who is left over that actually assists the survivors? And I'm not going to get into this too much. There has been some investigation of a particular agency and founder who there was some allegations of sexual harassment. I didn't get into it in this presentation, but I do quite a bit of international work. And so sometimes you'll see organizations going into low-income countries. And this connects back to like the white savior complex, right? Of folks who think that they are the people to save people in other countries. There are some allegations as well that the operations of trying to go into other countries and rescue victims actually created a demand for human trafficking, of them approaching someone who was then able to find survivors. So I would like to note that it's really important to be mindful of the organizations that we donate to. But there are some really great organizations in Utah. Asian Association is one that provides a lot of services for those experiencing human trafficking. And that includes sex trafficking and labor trafficking. And they serve those who are US citizens, permanent residents, and those who are immigrants and refugees. So that's one agency I'd like to, oh, thank you, Danielle. So Danielle has put the link in the chat. They're a great organization, and there are some others. There are, I think, a couple domestic violence organizations that reserve a few beds for survivors. So feel free to reach out to me. I do know of a couple other agencies that could be qualified to respond. And I think that is one of the issues, right? Is like we don't have enough agencies responding within our state. Oh, thank you, Edwin. This is so kind. Thank you so much for this presentation and the work that you do. Do you need any grad students on your team this summer? I've worked with a lot of housing services in the SLC area, and I'd love to get involved. I would love that. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm not sure. Funding is always an issue, right? So I will definitely be working with an undergraduate student and could possibly work with a graduate, but I can let you know what that's looking on later on. Veronica asks, is the national hotline only in English or other languages too. So the national hotline is great. It is available in 200 plus languages. So it's a great resource. Can you give some examples of what wraparound services for survivors would look like? That is great as well. And I think that we discussed that within the presentation a little bit. It's really, I think that one of the most primary needs is housing, whether that is, emergency housing, transitional housing, permanent supportive housing. And it's not just for this population. Like, this is such a big issue within our state and across the nation, but also services when it comes to substance use, mental health, et cetera. So we have some really good outreach that's happening. But my perception, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that sometimes the services are pieced together. And also there's at least one agency that serves survivors of sex trafficking specifically, which is residential. And so they have some of those wraparound services there. Another question, how would we as social workers distinguish sex workers out of desperation and people being trafficked? This is a fantastic question. So again, sex work relates to, and this is so political, I left it out of the presentation, but there are so many political tensions, both within the trafficking movement as well as when we think about sex work. And so some folks would say, anyone who's participating in commercial sex, they don't have choice. They're there because of exploitation and they have no other choice. And others would say that there's a continuum for sex work. So some, are being exploited and some would say, in a lot of low income work, people are exploited, but that others view this as a means to maybe get through school. As I said earlier, I lived in the Netherlands. And so in the Netherlands, sex work is legal. And one thing that has done, I think, is removed some of the stigma of sex work. And there is honestly a continuum, right, of folks working in a window versus private escort agencies. But I've talked a lot, to go back to your question, it's really that component of force, fraud, or coercion. So if a person is experiencing, they're an adult, they're engaged in commercial sex, and they're experiencing force, fraud, or coercion, that would be a situation of trafficking. Whereas if a person is voluntarily participating in commercial sex who is an adult, then that would be considered a sex worker. Now, legally, a minor who is participating in commercial sex, regardless if force, fraud, or coercion is present, is legally considered a trafficked person. And so that's important to consider as well. One question is, we're a small homeless shelter for families with young children. What practices can we implement to create an environment in our shelter that is safe and inclusive for this population? Wow, that is a big question. Let's see. I think that what it comes down to is, and I would be curious to know how many folks have experienced sex trafficking within the shelter, right? I think that there can be education and awareness targeted at, what might be the signs of trafficking, of encouraging conversations, of having families and children talk to each other. I think that youth who recognize that they have someone who's safe that they can talk to is really important. But I'd have to think more about that, and I'd happy to give you a more complete answer if you'd like to reach out to me. Juliana says, based on your research, is there any information about what specific type of mental health treatment is the most effective in addressing the emotional needs of victims of human trafficking? Fantastic question. I'm not a therapist, but evidence-based practices have been identified. So TFCBT, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, DBT, EMDR have all shown promise. with survivors and addressing trauma. And I think that there needs to be more research, though, on what these effective mental health treatments are. So great question. I think also thinking about trauma. So many social workers are very skilled in working with trauma. And so I would say that many of those skills that you've learned can also be applied to this population. Melanie says there was a movie released in 2023 called Sound of Freedom. Have you seen it, and what are your thoughts on it? Wow, Melanie, this connects back to our previous conversation about an organization that has been under investigation. I have not seen the movie, so I'm unable to give thoughts on it. From my general perception, I've kind of avoided it because I think that it might replicate this idea, right? That maybe white men from the United States should be going into low-income countries to rescue children. Maybe that's kind of makes me feel icky. So I haven't seen the movie. If others have seen it and like it, that's great. But I have some issues, and I think it feeds back into some of our myths and misconceptions about what human trafficking really looks like, right? So those are all of the questions in the Q&A. You guys kept me on my toes. There is one more actually. How can social workers and child welfare address situations where children might have deep connections to those who are trafficking them? And how can social workers help support children or youth when removed from situations? Another fantastic question. In the last 3 minutes, I'll give the best response I can. This is common, right? Is that oftentimes traffic survivors in the child welfare system do have a relationship with their trafficker. This could be someone that they view as an intimate partner. This could be a family member. We actually find that family members may exploit their children for substances. And so it's really difficult because the focus tends to be on our need or want to reunify kids with their families. And sometimes that's not always going to be possible when the family member has trafficked the child. So I think it's really developing that trust relationship with youth within the child welfare system, that you are a safe person. But I think it's so key to remember that survivors are the expert, right, in their own experience. So we wouldn't talk to a kid in child welfare and say, you were trafficked. I'm going to tell you that you are trafficked, and you need to understand that. I think what's key is really responding to those primary needs. So if a kid has needs around mental health or substance use, of really addressing those mental health needs, those primary needs. And then potentially when you develop that trusting relationship, then you can begin having those conversations, which I think could be initiated by the child themselves. So we have 1 minute left. This has been such a pleasure to be with you today. Again, you are always more than welcome to contact me at my email address. And thank you again for attending.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. And I will just echo the many, many, many comments. You should scroll through them of people talking about how excellent it was and how valuable your work is, and what a contribution today made, not to mention the overall reach in your support for what's needed to protect the rights of survivors of sex trafficking. I think it's clear to everyone today how fortunate the University of Utah and the College of Social Work is to have Dr. Gezinski here as a part of our faculty and part of our researchers. She is a leader in this area. She's been instrumental in helping us recruit new faculty members who are going to contribute to this work. And we're so very grateful, Lindsay, for all that you've done. I'd like to echo your call for students to apply for the summer program for undergraduate research. I think it's an incredible opportunity for students to engage in very meaningful research with excellent mentors. And also want to thank everyone who joined us today. So for those of you who are looking for continuing education hours, keep an eye out in your email. You will receive a recorded presentation and a brief quiz. Once you complete the quiz, then you'll get a CEU certificate emailed to you. So, in closing, the College of Social Work is committed to taking the evidence generated in our research, not only to future social workers who are sitting in our classrooms, but out into the community and beyond. We hope that you will join us for the college annual Beeley Lecture, which is going to be held on Thursday, February 8th at noon here in the College of Social Work. We will be joined by Dr. Charles Bell from the Illinois State University, who will discuss how biases in public education has contributed to the overrepresentation of Black students in school punishment settings, an incredibly important topic. You can find details about all of our events on our college's webpage. And with that, I thank each and every one of you for being here today and for the work that you do. And be kind, be safe, and be well, and take care.